Good morning. I stand before you not as a revolutionary leader, not as a moral prophet, and not as a spiritual guide. I stand before you as an observer, as a writer, as a thinker, as a man who has spent his life watching how things hold together and how they quietly, methodically fall apart. My work is not about changing the world. It is about understanding why the world resists change, why ideas resist clarity, why progress stalls, why certain problems persist for centuries, while others dissolve almost overnight. These are not moral questions, they are structural ones. This is not the story of a heroic life. There are no marches here, no prisons, no moments that history books circle in red. This is the story of a quiet life, a life spent mostly at desks, in notebooks, in unfinished drafts, in systems that work just well enough to reveal where they failed. It is from that quiet, uncelebrated terrain that everything I will share today has emerged. I formation. Before meaning. Before there is preservation, there is formation. Before a system can maintain anything, it must decide what is worth maintaining. Before meaning can be defended, it must first be shaped into something coherent enough to defend it all. In my life, formation did not arrive as a revelation. It arrived as constraint, as limitation, as the slow realization that I could not think everything at once, could not hold every possibility open, could not move forward without excluding alternatives. Formation happened in silence, in notebooks, in the margins of other people's ideas, in the early hours before dawn, when attention was fragile and choices mattered. I was not choosing between good and evil. I was choosing between coherence and noise, between what could be carried forward and what would dissolve under even minimal scrutiny. Every writer knows this moment. The blank page is not empty. It is saturated with possibility. But the first sentence is an act of exclusion. To write one sentence is to abandon 1,000 others. To commit to one direction is to collapse countless branching paths. Formation is not creative abundance. It is creative refusal. This was my first hard lesson. Structure precedes meaning. Before truth can be preserved, it must be formed. Before an argument can be defended, it must be constrained. Before a system can function, it must decide what it is not. I did not arrive at this insight through philosophy. I arrived at it through failure. 2. The cost of not forming. In my early work, I resisted formation. I wanted openness, flexibility, maximum expressive freedom. I believed that commitment was premature, that structure would emerge naturally if I just kept moving. It did not. What emerged instead was drift. Drafts that expanded without clarifying, projects that multiplied without converging, ideas that felt profound in isolation but collapsed when placed next to one another. This was not because the ideas were bad. It was because they were unformed. Without formation, nothing could be preserved. Without boundaries, there was no coherence to defend. Motion continued, but meaning thinned. Activity replaced progress. This is a mistake many systems make. We assume that motion will eventually generate structure. In reality, structure is what makes motion intelligible. A system that refuses formation does not remain free. It becomes incoherent. 3. The first commitment. Eventually, I made a decision. Not a public one. Not a dramatic one. A private, structural one. I committed to coherence. This meant choosing a limited set of questions and refusing to chase others. It meant allowing some ideas to die unfinished. It meant revising not to embellish, but to align. It meant learning to stop mid-thought when a sentence betrayed the structure it was meant to serve. This was not discipline imposed from the outside. It was discipline emerging from necessity. Formation, I learned, is not about creativity. It is about fidelity. Fidelity to a constraint you are willing to maintain. Once that commitment was made, preservation became possible. Difficulty did not vanish, but it became legible. Resistance began to signal something meaningful rather than random frustration. And that is where the next phase began. But that is not where we stop today, because formation is only the beginning. In the first part of this talk, I described formation, the act of choosing what is worth carrying forward. Formation is quiet, private, often invisible to anyone but the person doing the choosing. But once something is formed, once a structure exists, the real work begins. That work is preservation. Preservation. Motion under constraint. Preservation is not repetition. It is not maintenance in the trivial sense. Preservation is motion under constraint. It is the act of advancing while keeping something invariant. In writing, this means moving sentence by sentence without violating the argument. In thinking, it means exploring implications without dissolving the core distinction. In living, it means change that does not betray what you have committed to preserve. At first, I believed preservation would feel like progress. It did not. It felt like resistance. Every attempt to move forward encountered friction. Paragraphs refused to align. Arguments weakened when extended. Ideas that seemed stable collapsed when applied to new contexts. I interpreted this as failure. I thought difficulty meant I was doing something wrong, that I lacked intelligence, that I lacked discipline, that the work itself was flawed. Over time, I realized something essential. Difficulty was not a signal of error. It was the price of preservation. 2. Why difficulty appears. Preservation is expensive because it requires local enforcement. Every step forward must be checked against what already exists. Every addition must align. Every extension must reuse structure rather than replace it. Consider something as simple as counting. Counting is not motion for its own sake. It is structured motion. Each number must preserve the structure of the previous one. If you say 1, 2, 4, you have not merely skipped a value, you have broken the system. The sequence collapses because preservation failed. The same principle applies everywhere. In writing, if a conclusion contradicts its premise, preservation fails. In software, if a function violates its interface, preservation fails. In a life, if actions no longer reflect commitments, preservation fails. Difficulty appears exactly where preservation becomes costly, where the system must work hardest to remain coherent. This is not a personal flaw. It is a structural fact. 3. Horizons where preservation breaks down. As I continued working, I began to notice patterns in where difficulty concentrated. Certain problems resisted solution no matter how carefully I approached them. Certain chapters refused to close. Certain projects stalled despite sustained effort. These were not random obstacles. They appeared consistently at specific points. I came to understand these points as horizons. A horizon is not a metaphor. It is a structural boundary. It marks the limit beyond which a system can no longer preserve its invariance without redesign. At a horizon, reuse ends. Local checks fail. The cost of preservation spikes. Beyond that point, continuing forward does not deepen the work. It degrades it. 4. The mistake of pushing through. I did what most people do when they encounter a horizon. I pushed. I told myself that persistence was virtue, that effort would eventually overpower resistance, that stopping meant weakness. This was a mistake. Persistence beyond a horizon is not strength. It is violence. Violence against the structure you are attempting to preserve. When you push through a horizon without redesign, one of two things happens. You drift, continuing motion while slowly losing coherence. Or you collapse, continuing motion until the structure fails catastrophically. Neither outcome preserves meaning. V. Recognizing the signal. The turning point came when I stopped interpreting resistance as an enemy and began treating it as information. Difficulty, I realized, was a signal. Stalling was a signal. Repetition without clarification was a signal. These were not instructions to push harder. They were instructions to stop and reassess. A horizon does not demand more effort. It demands a different response. Once I understood this, my relationship to work changed. Stopping was no longer failure. Pausing was no longer avoidance. Refusal became a form of care, and that understanding opened the door to the most important discipline of all. But that belongs to the next part. If formation is the act of choosing what matters, and preservation is the effort required to carry it forward, then stopping is the discipline that protects both. Stopping is not an afterthought. It is not a failure state. It is not what happens when strength runs out. Stopping is what prevents collapse. The misunderstanding of stopping. We live inside a culture that mistrusts stopping. We praise endurance, so we celebrate hustle. We reward motion, even when motion has lost its relationship to purpose. From an early age, we are taught that stopping means quitting, that pausing signals weakness, that refusal is laziness, disguised as principle. This belief is so deeply embedded that many people cannot stop even when continuation is actively destroying what they value. I believe this too. When I encountered difficulty, I assumed the correct response was persistence. When work stalled, I doubled my effort. When coherence weakened, I pushed forward in the hope that clarity would eventually reappear. It did not. 2. Stopping as structural fidelity. The shift came when I recognized stopping as an act of fidelity rather than surrender. To stop is to say, this structure matters enough not to violate it. Stopping is the moment when preservation takes precedence over throughput, when meaning outranks productivity, when integrity outweighs momentum. In my work, stopping became deliberate. If a paragraph no longer aligned with the thesis, I stopped. If an argument required more explanation than insight, I stopped. If a project advanced only by repeating itself, I stopped. These stops were not dramatic. They were quiet, often invisible to anyone else, but they preserved the internal coherence of the work. Stopping is not global paralysis. It is local refusal. Trecci. Pause. The most misunderstood form of stopping. Not all stopping is final. Between motion and cessation lies pause. A pause is not collapse. A pause is not abandonment. A pause is tactical stillness. Pause occurs when preservation remains possible, but local conditions have degraded. Attention has thinned. Synchronization has failed. Verification has weakened. By pausing, the system creates space to restore those conditions without demanding redesign. In my life, pause often took the form of days without writing, of stepping away from a problem long enough for its structure to reassert itself, of refusing to add material when alignment could not be guaranteed. Pause is how systems breathe. Chetrity. Local checks, the mechanism of stopping. Stopping is not intuition. It is mechanism. Effective stopping requires local checks, small, enforceable conditions that halt motion when coherence is threatened. In software, a failing test stops deployment. In medicine, a mismatched record stops treatment. In finance, a suspicious transaction stops execution. These systems are not inefficient. They are ethical. They refuse to proceed when meaning is at risk. In my work, local checks became simple but strict. Does this extend the structure or merely decorate it? Does this clarify or obscure? Does this preserve alignment or simulate progress? If the answer was unclear, motion halted. V. Refusal as care. Refusal carries a negative connotation. We associate it with denial, obstruction, negativity. But refusal is how systems express care. To refuse incoherent motion is to protect meaning. To refuse premature continuation is to defend integrity. To refuse drift is to honor the original commitment. Stopping is not an absence of action. It is an action taken on behalf of structure. 6. The consequences of not stopping. When systems cannot stop, they do not remain neutral. They drift, they collapse, they continue producing outputs that resemble meaning, but no longer correspond to it. I have watched this happen in organizations, in relationships, in institutions, and in my own early work. Motion continues, metrics improve, activity increases, while coherence quietly dissolves. Stopping interrupts this decay, and once stopping becomes possible, a new kind of responsibility emerges. That responsibility carries us beyond the individual desk, beyond personal work, and into shared systems. That is where we will go next. Up to this point, I have spoken primarily from the interior of a single life, from the desk, from the page, from the private struggle to form, preserve, and stop without collapsing. But structures do not end at the individual. The moment more than one person is involved, the moment work is shared, decisions propagate, or responsibility diffuses, structure becomes ethical. 1. When structure becomes ethics. Ethics is often framed as intention, as virtue, as personal morality. But systems do not experience intention. They experience structure. A system does not fail because its participants are immoral. It fails because its mechanisms cannot preserve meaning under pressure. Structural ethics begins here, with the recognition that responsibility is embedded in design. If you design a process that cannot stop, you have designed a system that will eventually betray its purpose. If you reward output without verification, you have incentivized drift. If you remove local authority to refuse, you guarantee collapse will arrive silently. These are not philosophical abstractions. They are operational facts. 2. The expansion beyond the desk. Once I recognized this, I began to see the same patterns everywhere. In teams, work continued long after clarity was lost. In organizations, metrics replaced meaning. In institutions, procedures multiplied while purpose thinned. No one was acting maliciously. Everyone was doing their job. The failure was structural. Systems were built to advance, but not to pause, to optimize, but not to refuse, to scale, but not to preserve. 3. Authorizing the stop. The most ethical act in any system is to authorize stopping, not symbolically, not rhetorically, mechanically. Someone must be allowed to say, "This no longer aligns," without punishment. Some condition must halt motion when invariants are violated. Some process must privilege coherence over throughput. Without this, ethics becomes decoration. In healthy systems, stopping is not insubordination. It is maintenance. 4. Bridge rules and safe pause. Stopping does not mean abandonment. Well-designed systems include bridge rules, mechanisms that allow pause without collapse. A bridge rule says, we are not proceeding. We are not dissolving. We are restoring conditions. This might look like a review period that resets scope, a freeze on expansion until verification completes, a deliberate slowdown to reestablish alignment. Bridge rules are how systems survive horizons. V. Structural care. Care is often mistaken for kindness. Structural care is not kindness. It is protection. It protects the invariant. It protects participants from impossible demands. It protects meaning from erosion. In my own work, this meant refusing opportunities that would accelerate output at the cost of coherence. It meant declining visibility when visibility required distortion. It meant choosing smaller, slower systems that could stop over larger ones that could not. These choices were not moral performances. They were structural necessities. 6. Why this matters. When systems fail, the damage is rarely immediate. Collapse is preceded by drift. Drift is preceded by silence. Silence is preceded by the inability to refuse. Structural ethics is the discipline of restoring refusal before silence takes hold. This is not idealism, it is maintenance. And it prepares us for the final question every system must face. How does it end? All systems that form and preserve eventually encounter a final condition. Not a failure, not a collapse, an end. This is cessation. Cessation. Not failure, but completion. Cessation is often misunderstood as defeat, as exhaustion, as the moment when nothing more can be done. But true cessation is not the absence of strength. It is the presence of closure. Cessation occurs when a system has exhausted its reusable structure, when no further extension can occur without distortion, when continuation would produce volume, but not meaning. In my work, I learned to distinguish exhaustion from completion. Exhaustion leaves debris, completion leaves structure intact. To stop cleanly is not to abandon the work. It is to protect it from dilution. 2. Learning to end well. Ending well is a discipline. It requires resisting the temptation to add just one more clarification. It requires refusing to extend an argument past its horizon. It requires recognizing when explanation has turned into repetition. This is difficult because stopping at the right moment often feels premature. There's always more that could be said. There's always another angle, another elaboration, another defense, but coherence does not improve indefinitely. At a certain point, it degrades. Ending well means accepting that limit. 3. This is not Gandhi's life. It is important to say this clearly. This is not the life of a revolutionary. It is not the life of a saint. It is not the life of a moral exemplar. I am Jonathan Kendall. I work under the name ONOJK123. I am an artist, a writer, and a systems thinker. My work has unfolded quietly, incrementally, without spectacle. There are no marches in this story, no prisons, no national awakenings. There are notebooks, drafts, abandoned versions, long stretches of silence, careful refusals, deliberate stops. This philosophy did not emerge from heroism. It emerged from attention. 4. What remains after stopping? When a system ceases cleanly, something remains. Not motion, not productivity, not output. What remains is interpretability. The structure can be understood. The intent can be reconstructed. The meaning does not collapse into noise. This is the only legacy I claim. Not influence, not scale, not permanence, but coherence. V, the final horizon. Every life encounters a final horizon, a point beyond which no further preservation is possible. At that horizon, the question is not how to continue. It is how to stop. Will you collapse, leaving confusion behind? Or will you cease, leaving structure intact? The preparation is simple, but not easy. Name what you preserve, enforce it locally. Authorize stopping, refuse drift, end cleanly. 6. At rest. I do not stand before you with a call to action. I stand before you with a description. This is how a life can be lived without betraying itself. This is how work can end without collapsing. This is how meaning can be preserved by knowing when to stop. Formation, preservation, practice, cessation. This is the full arc. Thank you.